They thought she was broken. They thought he was beyond saving. But when a chained bride and a hunted outlaw crossed paths, they shattered every chain laid upon the Mun bullet, one truth, one name at a time. Before we dive in, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and hit the subscribe button. The wind clawed through the prairie, like it had a score to settle, howling past broken fence posts and slamming against the side of a rotted barn crouched near the edge of a dying road. Cale hadn't meant to stop there. He was bleeding from the shoulder, half-starved, and riding a stolen horse 2 days too long in the saddle. But the sun was going down, the vultures were circling the sky like they knew his name, and the barn was the only place for miles that still had a roof. He pulled the horse in, led it behind the sagging doors, and that's when he heard it, not a scream, not a cry, but a breath. Shallow, fragile, human. His boots whispered across dirt and straw, hand on the butt of his revolver, eyes narrowing as he stepped around crates and barrels left to rot. At first he thought it was a ghost. She was crumpled behind a stack of planks, hair matted with blood and dirt, face so pale he couldn't tell if she was dead or dreaming of it. Then she blinked, and he froze. Her ankle was chained to the beam. A real iron shackle. Skin rubbed raw around the bone. No clothes, but a thin linen shift meant for sleeping, not surviving. She tried to sit up, but hissed in pain and shrank back like a whipped animal. Cale raised both hands, stepping slow, like you might to calm a spooked mare. "Don't scream," he said, though her mouth never opened. "Ain't here to hurt you." Her eyes flicked to the chain. Her lips trembled. She didn't say thank you. She said nothing. But when he pulled a bolt cutter from his saddlebag and snapped the iron clean, she collapsed into his arms without resistance. Cale didn't ask who she was. Not yet. Some things you feel before you question, like how her ribs stuck out through her skin, or how her wrists bore the deep grooves of long captivity, or how, even now, she didn't ask where he planned to take her. He laid her across his horse and walked beside it, one hand holding the reins, the other on the knife at his belt. Not for her, but for whatever kind of man left a girl like that to die in silence. By moonlight they reached a narrow bluff, one Cale remembered from his youth. He built a fire in a shallow pit and gave her his last canteen. She drank slow, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to. He finally asked, "What's your name?" She looked at him like he'd said something dangerous. "Emily," she whispered. He knew she was lying, but he nodded anyway. "All right, Emily." She held the blanket he gave her tight across her chest and stared into the fire, as if it might burn her sins away. Cale watched her longer than he should have. Not with hunger, with something more dangerous. Recognition. He didn't know her face, but he knew her silence. He'd worn it once, too. It was the kind of silence you kept when the world forgot you. When pain became background noise. When crying stopped mattering. And in that silence, something inside Cale broke. The outlaw who'd gunned down a marshal in Missouri, robbed freight lines in Kansas, and slipped gallows more times than he could, Countha sat by that fire and made a vow without saying it aloud. He would kill whoever chained her, bury them if he had to, and if the whole world came for them both, then the world could burn. She finally asked, "What happens now?" Cale looked at the fire, then at her. "Now," he said, "you decide whether you want to stay free." She didn't speak, but when the flames flickered in her eyes, he saw the answer. And it was enough. The fire burned low by morning, but Cale didn't move. He sat with his back to the stone bluff, arms crossed over his chest, one eye on the horizon and the other on the girl who still called herself Emily. She hadn't spoken again, hadn't asked where they were headed, hadn't even flinched when he threw a saddle blanket over her shoulders like a shield against the rising wind. That kind of silence wasn't stubborn, it was learned, beaten into her, starved into her. She didn't carry herself like someone used to being saved. She carried herself like someone who no longer believed rescue was real. Cale rose when the sun crept over the hills and poured a measure of stale coffee into a tin cup. He handed it to her, watched her wrap both hands around it like it held more than heat, like it held a memory. He didn't ask where she was from. She would lie again, and he wasn't in the mood to pretend he believed her. But when he crouched to check the bruising on her ankle, her eyes flicked to his hands and something in her went still. Not fear. Recognition. "You're not a farmer," she said, voice low and cracked like she hadn't used it in weeks. "No," he said. "I'm not." Her jaw tightened like she'd been waiting for that answer and dreading it at the same time. She nodded slowly, and Cale caught at the shift, the calculation. The way she studied his weapons, his boots, the scar on his cheek like it told stories she hadn't heard yet. Then she said, "That man's the one who chained me. He said I was property." Cale felt his knuckles curl. "You're not. He said no one would come, no one would pay. That I was bought with bad money and he could do what he wanted." Cale stood. He didn't speak. Just walked back to the horse, packed the few scraps of food they had left, and tightened the saddle straps. She didn't need comfort, she needed movement. He understood that better than most. Sometimes, the only thing between you and breaking was the sound of hooves hitting dirt. As they rode, the wind picked up, brushing loose strands of her hair across his arm where she leaned weakly behind him. It wasn't trust yet, but it was closeness, and Cale knew the difference. They crossed into pine country by late afternoon, and it wasn't until they stopped near a creek that he noticed the pattern she was watching: the trees, the slope of the land, the twist in the river like she was tracking something invisible. He asked, "You been this way before?" She shook her head, but it was too quick, too practiced. "You running from someone?" "I already did," she said. "Now I'm running towards something." That made Cale pause. He crouched by the stream, scooping water in his hands, watching her reflection instead of his own. "You got someone out there?" "I did," she said, voice barely a whisper. "But he died." Her fingers dug into the saddle blanket, knuckles pale. "I think he was my brother. I never got to know for sure, but I think he was." Kyle said nothing, just handed her a piece of jerky. She took it without thanks, but he didn't need one. Trust wasn't built on words. It was built on whether someone let you see their hunger. They made camp near a grove of cedar. As night fell, Kyle heard coyotes in the distance and scanned the hills for movement. He didn't like how fast the sun was dropping, or how quiet she'd gone again. She sat by the fire, rubbing her wrists like phantom chains still clung to them. Then she said, "I used to write letters. To no one, just folded them and buried them under floorboards. I think I thought if I wrote enough, he might find me anyway." Kyle looked up. "Your brother?" "I don't know if he even knew I existed. But there was a name once, etched in a book my mother hid. Same last name as the outlaw they said. Killed a U.S. Marshal in Missouri." Kyle didn't breathe. Her voice dropped to a hush. The name was Cale. He stood, heart pounding slow and heavy like thunder in the bones. She didn't flinch when he drew his revolver. Just stared into the fire and said, "I think I was born for someone else. But they sold me before I could find out who." The wind shifted. The coyotes stopped howling, and Kyle realized she wasn't just running. She was circling back to something. A truth buried deep, clawing to be known. And if he didn't want to believe the look in her eyes, he'd have to silence the one in his own. Because the moment she said his name, the past stopped being dead. And somewhere in that firelight, he saw etched in the way she held pain, carried silence, and refused to beg. She didn't just have his name, she had his blood. Kyle didn't sleep that night. The fire crackled low between them, shadows creeping up the bark of the cedar trees like ghosts on the move. Emma Leaf, that was her real name, slept with one hand under her blanket and the other curled protectively over her middle, like she expected someone to rip her apart in her dreams. Cale sat with his back against a rock, hat tilted forward, revolver resting across his knees. But his mind wouldn't let go of the name she'd spoken. Not just the name, the way she'd said it. Like she'd known it her whole life. Like she'd been born with it carved into her ribs. Kyle hadn't told anyone his full name in years. Not since the day his mother died and the man who raised him burned the only photograph they owned. Not since he rode out of Missouri with a bounty on his head and a pistol he didn't fire unless he had to. But something about that girl, her voice, her scars, her silence carried pieces of a life he thought he'd buried in the dirt outside St. Louis. When dawn came, she stirred slowly, blinking against the gray sky. her face drawn and pale. Cale tossed her a biscuit from his pack and poured the last of their coffee into a shared tin. "Where were you born?" he asked, quiet. She didn't look at him. "I don't remember." "Try." "I said I don't remember," she snapped, and for the first time he saw fire in Hernet rage, but something desperate underneath. He didn't press. Not yet. They rode west, toward the bluffs that carved the land like bones beneath skin. Kyle knew the hills here, knew where the marshals patrolled, and where the old smuggling routes cut through ravines like secret veins. She rode behind him again, but this time her hands didn't tremble. If anything, they gripped tighter than before. That afternoon they stopped by a dry creek bed Cale, checking their trail to make sure no one had followed. That's when he saw Ita ridge of boot prints too fresh to be chance. One man, heavy, wide gait, maybe 2 hours behind. Cale crouched and pressed his palm to the dirt, jaw tightening. "We've got company," he said when he returned. She didn't flinch, just said, "Is it him?" Cale didn't ask who, he just shook his head. "Not unless your captor wore marshal boots." Her eyes narrowed. "Federal? Maybe. Or someone who wants the reward. How much is your head worth?" "Enough to keep me moving." She nodded slowly. "And mine?" Cale looked at her. Really looked. At the dirt on her skin, the bruises, the way she sat with her shoulders hunched like a girl half her size. "Depends who's asking," he said. That night they camped in an old mining cabin near the canyon rim. Cale barricaded the door with broken timber and set a bell trap by the window, his instincts sharper now that they were being followed. She curled up in the corner on a pile of blankets, but sleep didn't take her. Kyle watched her eyes in the moonlight wide, haunted, far away. "What happened to your brother?" he asked softly. Her mouth parted, but no sound came for a long moment. "Then, he was older. My mother said he was trouble. Said he was taken away for hitting a man who hurt her. She never said his name, just that we were better off without him." Kyle's chest burned. "And you don't know if it was me?" "I don't know anything. Only that I had dreams of someone with a scar on his face. Someone who shot to protect, not for greed. Someone who left letters in tree knots, like he wanted to be found but couldn't risk it." Kyle looked at the floorboards. "I did that," he said. "I left letters in tree knots." She sat up, breath catching. "You did?" "Outside a red cabin on Whispering Hill. That's where she used to take me before the law came. I carved my name in the pine there, just once. I lived there," she whispered. "Years later, after she died, I used to dream of that place, like it was waiting for someone." Cale's hands curled into fists. Then maybe it was. The wind howled through the broken chimney. Emilior, whatever her name was, stood slowly, crossed the room like she wasn't sure her feet were real. "I had a scar," she said, "on my back, from a nail in the floorboards. I never told anyone." Cale stepped closer. "Then you know that cabin." "I know the silence in it," she said. "I know the ghosts." He reached out, slowly, like approaching a wild animal. His hand hovered by her shoulder, waiting. She didn't flinch. Just let her head fall forward, eyes closing, and for the first time since he'd found her in that barn, she breathed like she didn't have to hide. Kyle knew then. He didn't need a letter or a blood test. He saw it in her bones, in the stubborn tilt of her chin, in the quiet rage that pulsed under her calm. She wasn't just someone he saved. She was someone he lost. They rode without speaking for most of the morning, dust kicking up behind the mare's hooves, the sun already burning the sky into white and gold. Cale led them along a trail few remembered, the kind drawn in blood and silence rather than maps, a path that curled west through whispering pines until the land grew hushed like it too was holding its breath. The girl his sister, though neither of them dared, say the word aloud, yet clung to the saddle behind him with her chin near his shoulder. And though her hands were steady, he could feel something shifting in her grip, like the weight of memory finally had somewhere to settle. They crested a hill by late noon, and there it was, the cabin. Small, weather-worn, leaning slightly south like a man who'd lost too many fights but refused to fall. Cale dismounted without a word, tying the reins to the old hitch post that still bore the shallow knife mark where he once carved a K into the wood. She stood there a moment, one hand to her mouth, the other tracing invisible lines across the air. "It's the same," she whispered. "Even the broken shutter." "I fixed that 3 times," Kyle muttered. "Gave up when the wind kept finding it." She stepped up to the door but didn't open it. Her fingers hovered above the latch like it might bite. "There was a hole in the floor," she said. "By the hearth. I used to hide things in it. Feathers, pebbles, that looked like eggs. A button with a blue star." Cale stared at her. "That button was mine." Her eyes snapped to his. "You left it there." "No," he said quietly. "I put it in the floor to remember. I thought maybe one day someone would find it." Her lips trembled, and without another word, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dust swirled in the air like old ghosts. The hearth was still half full of ash, and the rocking chair Cale's mother once sat in lay overturned in the corner. He followed her in slowly, his boots thudding against the wood like a heartbeat. She knelt by the fireplace and pried up a loose board with careful fingers. Beneath it, nothing but shadows, until she reached down and pulled out a scrap of blue fabric. The button, still there. Her shoulders shook, and for a moment Cale thought she was crying, but when she turned around, her face was calm, eyes shining with something deeper than grief, something that looked like coming home. "I never believed in signs," she said, "but this feels like more than chance." Cale nodded, throat thick. "It is." They stayed there the rest of the day, cleaning what they could, clearing the dust and setting traps for rabbits Kyle knew still ran nearby. By nightfall, they had a fire going and the scent of pine needles curling through the rafters. She sat wrapped in a blanket on the floor, staring at the flames, while Cale checked the locks and slid a rifle beside the door. "How long do we have before they catch up?" she asked softly. "A day, maybe less. And what then? We run again. Or we fight." Her gaze flickered to him. "You always carry that revolver. How many men have you killed?" Cale didn't answer at first. Then, "Enough to wish I hadn't," she nodded. "I think I understand that." "I doubt it." "No," she said, voice sharper now. "I do, because I did something too. Something I can't take back." Cale turned toward her slowly. "What?" She looked away. "There was a man, after the barn. He offered to help, said he knew someone in the marshal's office. I trusted him." Her voice broke. "I shouldn't have." Kyle's chest tightened. "What did he do?" "Sold me back to the merchant. But before he did, Second slit his throat with a carving knife." She said it without flinching. "I didn't even check if he was dead. I just ran." Kyle knelt beside her. "You did what you had to." "So did you," she whispered. "But they call you an outlaw." He stared into the fire. "Titles don't mean much when the system writes the story. Then we write our own." Her voice was a whisper, but it held weight, like something rising from deep earth. Kyle reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment yellowed, creased, but still legible. "This is a deed," he said, "to a place beyond the ridgeline. Old land, never claimed proper. I stole it from a man who never intended to work it." "Why?" "Because I wanted to give someone a life that couldn't be taken." He looked at her then. Really looked. "You still want to run?" She stared at the flames. "A long time." "No," she said. "Not anymore." "Then we'll fight," Cale said. "And if they come, we make this cabin remember us." She smiled, just barely. And for the first time since he'd found her chained in the dark, she looked less like a girl trying to survive and more like a woman ready to live. Kyle woke to the sound of horses. Not the kind that wandered or grazed, but the kind that rode with purpose, hooves thudding like war drums against the cold forest floor. He was on his feet in a breath, boots silent against the wooden planks as he crossed to the door and peered through the slats. 5 riders, maybe 6. Moving slow, scanning the tree line, like wolves who smelled the wound before they saw the prey. He didn't need to see the brands on their saddlebags to know who they were. Kershaw's men, bounty hunters. The kind who smiled when they broke fingers and asked questions after pulling teeth. Behind him, she stirred. He turned quickly, kneeling beside her. "Don't talk," he whispered. "Just move. Now." She blinked, dazed, then froze when she heard the hooves. No questions, no panic. She just nodded, gathered the blanket, and followed him. He opened the trapdoor beneath the Rugen old root cellar, dark and cold, but hidden well. She climbed down with a look of grim familiarity, like this wasn't her first time disappearing underground. Cale replaced the rug, then scattered a few cut logs over it. Not perfect, but fast. Then he grabbed his rifle, stepped outside, and shut the cabin door behind him, like a man going to meet fate halfway. The riders slowed when they saw him. One dismounted. The others stayed in their saddles, hands near holsters, eyes hungry. "Cale Windwalker," the lead said, spitting his name like poison. "You're a hard man to find." "Then stop looking," Cale replied. "You're trespassing. So's the girl you stole. We got a warrant, says she belongs to Merchant Bell." Cale's jaw flexed. "People don't belong to anyone," the man grinned. "You ain't been in town lately, huh?" He took a step closer. "I don't need to kill you. Just hand her over and you can ride out. You've got 20 seconds to decide." Cale lifted his rifle slowly. "Don't need that long." The man's smile dropped. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Kyle cocked the lever. "Want to bet your teeth on it?" Silence rippled like heat between them. Then one of the men flinched. Kyle fired. The shot echoed through the pines like thunder, dropping one rider before the rest could draw. Then it was chaos gunfire, cracking, horses screaming, Cale diving behind the well as splinters flew. He counted shots, knew their rhythm, knew how panic made men stupid. He popped up, fired twice. Another man fell, clutching his shoulder, crawling for cover. They retreated fast after that, dragging their wounded, 2 dead left behind like offerings. Kyle stood over the bodies, breathing hard, blood dripping down his arm from a graze he hadn't noticed. He walked back inside, locked the door, then rolled the rug aside. She emerged, pale but steady. "You're bleeding," she said. Later, he replied, "We have to move." "Where?" "Southridge. There's a stream, hidden paths. If we can reach the ravine, we'll lose them." She nodded, already gathering supplies. Her hands didn't shake. "You killed 2 men. They would have done worse." "I'm not afraid of you," she said quietly. "I thought I would be, but I'm not." Cale looked at her, then nodded. "Good, because this doesn't end here." She helped him pack. Neither spoke of the blood or the smoke curling outside the window. They left before dusk, riding through shadows that stretched like claws across the land, both of them silent as they rode deeper into a wilderness that offered no guarantees. But Kyle knew one thing: he would not let her be chained again. Not by a merchant, not by the law, not even by her own past. And for the first time since this all began, he didn't feel like an outlaw. He felt like something older, something righteous, something dangerous to the men who thought justice came with a price tag and a badge. The girl no. The woman rode beside him, eyes fixed ahead, and Cale knew the war had just begun. They reached the ravine just before dawn, the sky bruised with purple and streaked gold along the ridge. But Cale didn't stop to admire it. He tied off the horse beneath a rocky outcrop, then helped her down, his hands gentle but rushed, urgency etched into every line of his body. The air smelled of pine needles and river mist, clean and sharp, but the girl's face was drawn tight, her silence heavier than before. Cale noticed the way she winced when she moved, and when he brushed her arm, she flinched not from him, but from whatever ghosts she carried in her skin. "Sit," he said quietly, guiding her to a dry patch near the boulders. "We're safe here, for now. I'll get the fire started." She didn't argue, didn't ask what came next, just sat and watched him, with eyes too old for her face. When the flames caught and the smoke twisted upward like a prayer, she finally spoke. "You never asked my name." Cale looked up, pausing over the tin cup he'd filled with water. "Didn't think you'd want to give it." "I didn't," she said, "but I do now." He waited, steady as stone. She took a breath, then exhaled, like it hurt. "It's Marin Bell." The name hit him like a pistol crack. His back stiffened. "Bell?" he repeated, low and slow. "As in Merchant Bell?" She nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "His niece. Or, that's what he told folks. Said he was doing charity, raising me after my parents died. But really, I was just..." Inventory. Something he planned to sell from the beginning. Cale sat across from her, eyes dark with something deeper than anger. That's why you didn't tell me. Would you have freed me if you'd known? He didn't answer right away. The fire popped between them, but his gaze didn't move. Yes, he said finally, because no one deserves what I saw. Not even a Belle. She flinched at the name. I don't want it. Not anymore. Then don't carry it, Cale said. Names only have power if we let them. She stared at him, something raw and fragile breaking through her fear. Why did you help me? Cale shifted, the weight of his rifle across his lap a familiar comfort. Because I've worn chains, Marin, not on my wrists, but on my name, my skin, my blood. Folks look at me and see savage, outlaw, half-breed. Doesn't matter if I saved their child from a flood or killed a man who deserved it, they've already decided what I am. But you were locked in a barn like a wild thing, and the way you looked at me, I saw it. You knew what it meant to be caged. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. I thought no one saw me. I prayed, but no one came. Then you did, and I thought maybe I was dead. Maybe I was dreaming. You're not dreaming, Cale said. And we're not done running. Marin looked up sharply. You think they'll follow us? They won't stop until I'm dead and you're back in a cage. Belle has money, connections, but we've got something they don't. What's that? The truth, and grit, and each other. She smiled, the first real one he'd seen from her. It was small, crooked, but it lit her face in a way that made his chest ache. That almost sounded like hope. Don't get used to it, he muttered, standing to check the horizon. Hope's a luxury out here. But even as he said it, he felt something stir, something like belief, dangerous and unfamiliar. He crouched by her again, placed a rough, calloused hand over hers. From now on, you choose who you are. You're not Belle's. You're not broken. You're Marin, and you're free. She nodded slowly, fingers tightening around his. And you, Cale? What are you? He looked into the fire, then back at her. I don't know yet, but maybe I'll figure it out on the trail. The wind shifted then, carrying a sound that made his spine tighten, a distant echo of dogs. Not close, not yet, but moving. Marin heard it too, her body tensing, fear rising again like a tide. We have to go, she whispered. Now, Cale nodded, already packing the fire out with dirt and boots. Saddle up. This trail leads to Old Creek Pass. We can make it by nightfall if we ride hard. As they mounted, Kyle caught one last look at her face, still pale, still bruised, but set with something new. Not just fear, fire. He recognized it because he carried it too. They rode fast, wind in their faces, hooves pounding against earth like a drumbeat of defiance. And behind them, the name Belle faded into dust, while something unnamed, something wild and new, took its place. The sun baked the canyon walls like Killine-fired brick, every rock casting long, sharp shadows, as Cale and Marin galloped hard along the narrow path that wound along the cliff's edge. The hooves of their horses struck sparks where they met stone, and sweat clung to their backs like second skins. The dogs were gone now, their howls swallowed by distance, but neither of them trusted the quiet. It was the kind of silence that tricked a person into thinking they were safe right before a rifle cracked through the trees. Kyle kept his eyes forward, watching the twists of the trail, the curve of the ravine, the tilt of Marin's body as she leaned with her horse. She didn't ride like a girl from the city. She rode like someone with something to prove. Slow it down, he called when the trail narrowed again, voice rough from dust and tension. Rocks ahead, she obeyed, pulling the reins just enough, her eyes locked on his, trusting him without question, and he hated how much that trust meant to him. They reached a shaded overhang near the creek's fork, and Cale raised a hand, signaling to stop. The horses huffed, their flanks heaving. Marin dismounted first, legs trembling beneath her but not giving way. You think they're still behind us? She asked. Cale listened to the air, to the whispers of the forest. They'll come, he said. But we've got time. Not much, but enough. Marin nodded and knelt by the stream, splashing her face, letting the cold water wash away the grime and fear. though her bruises were still plain as day. Kyle stood a few feet away, back to her, watching the trees. His rifle hung across his shoulder, his hand always near the grip. He didn't know how to rest anymore. Not truly. "You've done this before," she said softly behind him. "Run. Fight. Hide." He turned his head slightly. "I've done worse, but not for someone," she said, rising. "For yourself, maybe, but not like this." Cale didn't answer. He didn't know how. She stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until he could hear her breathing. "What did they do to you, Cale?" He looked at her then, and something broke loose behind his eyes, just a flicker. But she saw it. "They called me a killer before I ever held a gun. Called me a thief before I ever took a damn thing. All because my mother was Comanche and my father wasn't. They buried names like mine in shallow graves and called it justice." Marin reached for his hand but didn't touch it. "You saved me," she whispered. "That's what I know. Whatever came before, you're not him now." Cale stared at her, at the line of her jaw, the fierceness of her wounds, the strength that rose from them like steam from hot stone. "You talk like someone who's seen hell." "I have," she said steady, "but I'm done living there." He looked down at the stream, then back up at the canyon wall. "There's a cave," he said, pointing toward a slit in the rock barely visible behind the trees. "Old smuggler route. We can hide there until night. They won't find us unless they're bloodhounds with wings." They climbed on foot, leading the horses carefully along a narrow ridge that sloped toward the cave. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of old lichen and ash. There were scratches on the walls from past travelers, initials carved into stone, stories no one would ever read. They made camp quietly, the fire small and hidden from view. Cale sat with his back to the entrance, listening. Marin leaned against the far wall, arms around her knees, her gaze somewhere between memory and survival. "Tell me something good," she said suddenly. He looked over, caught off guard. "Like what?" "Anything. I want to remember there's good in this world. Just for a minute." Kyle took a long breath. "When I was 8, I got lost in the southern hills. Thought I was a goner. But this old mountain dog found me. Just walked up, wagged his tail, and sat beside me like he'd been sent. I followed him, and he led me back to the village. Never saw him again. But I still hear his paws when I'm real quiet." Marin smiled. "That's good," she said. "Thank you." The fire crackled between them. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Cale said, "Your name it means sea, doesn't it?" "Yes," she whispered. "It means sea, but I've never seen one." "Me neither," Cale said. "Maybe one day." She nodded slowly, like that was a promise too fragile to say aloud. He didn't say it then, but he already knew if they made it out of this, he'd take her there, to the sea, to the edge of the world if that's what it took. But for now, he only said, "Get some rest, I'll watch." And as she drifted to sleep, he watched her like a man guarding something sacred. Because for the first time in a long, long while, Cale Windwalker wasn't just running from something, he was running toward it. The sound reached them first metal on stone, slow and deliberate like a death bell rung by a steady hand. Cale stiffened against the cave wall, his grip tightening on the rifle, every muscle in his body coiled like a rattler about to strike. Marin was already awake, eyes wide in the dark, her body still as breath held too long. The fire had been out for hours, their camp reduced to glowing ash and silence, but whoever was approaching wasn't fooled by night. He wasn't rushing, he was hunting. Kyle moved like a ghost, motioning Marin back deeper into the shadows, pressing her against the wall behind a jut of stone just wide enough to shield her body. Her heartbeat thudded against his arm as he passed, her hand brushing his wrist for one fleeting second before he stepped forward, toward the mouth of the cave. The footsteps paused outside. Then a voice, rough as grit and whiskey, drifted in like smoke. "Cale Windwalker, I know you're in there. Don't bother denying it. The wind told me." Cale didn't reply. He knew that voice. Jesse Brandt, bounty hunter turned butcher, a man who'd traded every scrap of decency for a bag of silver, and a reputation for never missing his mark. "You've got a girl with you," Jesse said, amused now. Don't worry, I'm not here for her. But the price on your head? It just went up. They say you broke a merchant's jaw and stole property. Interesting word they used, property. Kael's jaw tightened. His voice, when it came, was low and calm. She ain't property. And you know it. Jesse laughed. That's the problem with you, Windwalker. Always playing hero. You think the world'll bend for honor? You think a girl like that don't come with a price? You're a fool. But I'm a reasonable man. Step outside, and I won't put a bullet in her. The cave went quiet. Even the trees seemed to hush. Marin's fingers dug into the rock beside her, eyes burning in the dark. She saw Kael step toward the entrance like a man walking into his own grave, and without thinking she whispered, "Don't." He paused. Just a moment, but it was enough. "So she speaks," Jesse said, pleased. Sweet voice. Bet the merchant liked that. Tell me, sweetheart, did he keep you for himself or pass you around the card table? Kael moved before he thought. He fired once, the shot echoing through the canyon like thunder. But Jesse had already ducked, the bullet chipping stone. Outside came the sound of hooves, of movement, of men scattering into cover. Not alone. Jesse had brought friends. Kael pulled back fast, whispering, "We need out. Now." He grabbed Marin's hand, and they darted through the narrow passage behind the main chamberway he hadn't mentioned before, kept in reserve for moments just like this. The tunnel bent sharply, leading upward, through a slit in the stone and out onto a ridge that overlooked the forest below. The stars stretched overhead like a broken net, the moon painting everything in silver and bone. Behind them, voices cursed, echoed, split by gunfire as Jesse's men entered the cave too late. Kael and Marin moved fast, half running, half climbing down the ridge. They didn't speak until the canyon had swallowed the sound of boots and bullets behind them. When they reached the cover of a pine thicket, Marin sank to her knees, chest heaving. "He knew your name," she said. "He called you Windwalker." Kael crouched beside her, scanning the trees. "It's mine," he said. "What's left of it?" She looked at him then, shadows playing across his face. "I thought your name was Kael." "It is. Windwalker was my mother's. I carry it because no one else does. Because they tried to erase it." Marin's eyes glistened. "That's not why he's after you. It's more than the merchant. More than me." Kael nodded slowly. "He's been tracking me since Missouri. I took something from him. Not gold, not land, pride. I spared a life he meant to end. Made him look weak. He don't forget things like that," Marin whispered. "Then we'll have to be stronger." He looked at her, surprised. "You say that like you mean it." She leaned forward, her voice steady, even as her hands shook. "I do. I'm not that girl in the barn anymore. I'm not waiting for someone to save me. I'm standing because you showed me how." Kael didn't speak. He didn't know how to carry her words. So he did what he knew. He pressed his forehead to hers, and for one breathless second, the world held still. Then he pulled back and said, "There's a trapper's cabin 10 miles west. If we ride fast, we can reach it by dawn. After that, we'll have to keep moving." "Then we ride," she said. And they did, into the dark, into the unknown. With iron at their backs and fire in their chests, they rode not just for survival, but for something neither of them had named, yet something that felt a lot like hope. The wind had a strange silence to it that morning, like even the trees were holding their breath, and Kael felt it before he saw the smoky, low, curling ribbon rising just beyond the ridge. Too steady to be morning mist, too dark to be harmless. He reined in his horse, Marin doing the same behind him, her eyes scanning the tree line with a quiet fear that matched his own. "That's the trapper's cabin," Kael muttered, voice low. "Or what's left of it." They dismounted quickly, Kael pulling his rifle free, every step measured as they crept through the brush. The horses stayed tethered under a crooked pine, ears flicking nervously, as if they too knew something was wrong. The smell hit them first: burnt pine, scorched leather, something metallic underneath like blood on rusted nails. The cabin had been gutted by fire. The walls were blackened skeletons, the roof half collapsed, and what remained of the door swung crooked on one hinge, creaking softly in the wind. Kael moved forward slowly, scanning the ground, eyes sweeping for tracks. This was deliberate, he said. No lightning, no accident. Marin's face was pale, her fingers clutching the shawl around her shoulders. Do you think it was Jesse? Cale nodded grimly. He knew we'd come here. Either he beat us to it, or he left this as a message. Inside the ruin, ash crumbled under Cale's boots. A charred chair lay in pieces by the hearth, and beside it, the broken remnants of a trapper's coat fur, singed to a crisp buttons melted. Kyle crouched near the fireplace, brushing soot aside with the edge of his rifle. Underneath, something caught the light of bullet casing, recently fired. His jaw tightened. They were here last night, he said. He's closing in. Marin didn't speak. She stood at the edge of the wreckage, staring into the ashes like they held ghosts. Her voice was quiet when she finally asked, "How do you live like this? Always running? Always hunted?" Cale looked at her, his face a hard study of lines carved by fire and loss. "You don't live, you endure." He stood, his hand brushing her arm as he passed. "Come on, we can't stay here." But she didn't move. She was staring at something near the far corner, half buried beneath charred wood. Cale followed her gaze, then crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt, pulling the debris aside, revealing what had caught her eye: a necklace, burned but not destroyed. The pendant was a piece of carved bone, smooth and round, etched with a symbol Kyle recognized instantly. "That's Lakota," he whispered. Marin touched it with shaking fingers. "It was mine, when I was a girl, before they took me." Cale's eyes narrowed. "How did it get here?" She shook her head, but her breath hitched, and suddenly it was too much: the smell, the memory, the ruin. She turned away, arms around her ribs like she could hold herself together by force. "I think he's playing with us," she said, voice trembling. "He wants us to know he's always one step ahead." Cale didn't argue. He pocketed the pendant, then gently took her hand. "Then we stop running where he expects. We pick a road he doesn't see coming." "Where?" she asked, voice raw. "We don't have friends, Cale." "Not out here." He studied her for a long moment, then said, "We don't need friends. Just a ghost." She looked at him, confused, but he was already moving, back to the horses, eyes on the horizon like he saw something no one else could. Once mounted, they rode west, deeper into the hills, the smoke from the burned cabin fading behind them like a wound that refused to heal. Hours passed. The sky grew heavy with cloud, and the wind picked up, sharp and cold. They stopped only once, to drink from a stream that cut through the ravine like a blade. Kyle checked the tracks behind them clean, for now, but it wouldn't last. "We'll head toward Dead Hollow," he said as they rode again. "There's an old mining tunnel the soldiers used before the war. It's hidden, forgotten. If we're lucky, we can rest there for a night. Maybe 2. Marin nodded, her face unreadable. But as they rode, she turned the pendant over and over in her palm, the weight of it stirring memories she had long buried beneath silence. By dusk, the terrain had shifted steeper, rockier, the trees growing sparse. A hawk circled overhead, screeching once before disappearing beyond the ridge. They reached the entrance just as the sun kissed the horizon. Hidden by thick scrub and shadowed by a crag of stone, the tunnel looked like nothing more than a bear's den, forgotten and swallowed by time. Cale helped Marin dismount, then lit a lantern and led her inside. The tunnel was dry, the air cool, the silence deep. Save for now, they didn't speak much that night. Kyle sat at the entrance, watching the sky darken, rifle across his knees. Marin lay curled on a blanket beside the fire, the pendant still clutched in her hand. But before she drifted to sleep, she whispered one question into the quiet. "Why do you keep helping me?" Cale didn't turn. "Because they chained you like an animal," he said. "And I was raised to believe no human being deserves that." She was quiet a long time before answering. "What if I told you I wasn't the only one?" His breath caught, but he didn't press her. Not yet. Instead, he said the only thing that felt true. "Then we break every chain." Marin didn't sleep that night. She stared into the flames, barely blinking, her fingers still curled around the bone pendant like it was the last living thing tethering her to a past she couldn't decide whether to remember or bury. Kyle sat against the rock wall of the cave with his rifle balanced across his lap, his eyes half-lidded but not asleep. They were both waiting, one for sleep that wouldn't come, the other for answers that might destroy what little trust they'd built. Just before dawn, when the fire had faded to embers and the wind outside the cave had died down into an eerie stillness, Marin finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse and quiet, but it cut through the silence like the edge of a blade. "That pendant belonged to a boy I knew when I was very young. He gave it to me before they took us both." Cale didn't move. His gaze flicked to her face, but he said nothing. "I was 7, she continued, her eyes still fixed on the ashes. "He was 9. They called us mutts, half-breeds, sold us to the same man in Kansas, a man who promised to civilize us." Her lips trembled. "He chained us in a barn. Told the boy he was too wild to be trusted. Beat him when he spoke Lakota. I never saw the boy again after the 3rd night. I thought he was dead." Kyle's heart beat louder in his ears. "What was his name?" he asked, though he already knew. He could feel the shape of it pressing against the inside of his chest. She looked at him then, finally, really looked. Her voice broke. "Kalen." His throat closed. The name hit him like a gunshot, like a ghost yanking the air out of his lungs. He stood too quickly, the rifle slipping from his lap, clattering to the ground. Marin flinched, but she didn't look away. "Is that you?" she asked. "Is it really you?" He paced a few steps toward the mouth of the cave, like he needed space to breathe, to think, to make sense of a memory too mangled by pain to trust. "I didn't remember your name," he whispered. "Only your face, your voice." He turned to her slowly, the firelight catching the tears in his eyes. "You had a scar on your wrist, a burn mark. I remember holding your hand so you wouldn't scream when he poured the lie." Marin nodded, and in one trembling motion pulled back her sleeve to reveal the faded scar, still there after all these years. It was her. It had always been her. "I thought you were dead," he said, his voice raw. "I was beaten so bad that night I couldn't move. When I came to, you were gone. I spent years trying to find the man who took you, and I spent years trying to forget," she said quietly. "Until I heard your name spoken in a saloon. An outlaw, they said, half-blood. Said you killed a marshal who called you a dog." Cale's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill him for calling me a dog. I killed him because he had a girl chained to a wagon in the yard, just like we were. She couldn't have been more than 11. Marin's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. She stood and walked toward him, slowly, like approaching something sacred and broken. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" He shook his head. "Didn't know. Not for sure. That pendant. I carved dozens of them, gave them away to anyone who needed something to hold on to. But that one, I knew it the second I saw it." She touched his chest, her fingers resting just over his heart. "I've dreamed of this moment so many times, I thought I'd made you up." Kyle took her hand in both of his, breathing in like it hurt. "We're not those children anymore," he said. "But we're still standing, and maybe that means something." The wind shifted outside, howling low through the tunnel, a mournful sound like a warning. Kyle's head turned, body tensing. "Get your things," he said. "We can't stay here any longer." "Is it Jesse?" she asked, already grabbing the blanket and saddlebags. Cale nodded. "He's closing in faster than I thought." They broke camp in silence, but something between them had changed, something fundamental. Not just shared survival now, but a reckoning, a return. They rode hard through the trees, ducking low branches, hooves kicking up dry leaves. By midday, they stopped near a shallow ravine to rest the horses and eat, and Kyle used the moment to finally ask, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Marin hesitated, then answered, "Because I wasn't sure who you were. I've met so many men with your name. None of them ever looked back." He nodded slowly, understanding. "I'm looking now," she smiled, faint and trembling, like it might crack if she held it too long. "Then let's keep riding." And they did. Together, towards something neither of them could name, but both had waited their whole lives to find. The rain started just as they reached the old stone bridge, a thin, misting drizzle that turned the dirt road into a slurry of mud and the sky into one endless sheet of gray. Cale pulled his hat lower against the damp and kept his eyes on the ridgeline, searching for movement, for danger, for Jessie. Marin rode beside him, soaked through but silent, her back straighter than it had been in days. She hadn't let go of the pendant since the night in the cave, not once, as if it were a lifeline pulling her back from a place too dark to name. They'd ridden for 3 days without stopping long enough to let the dust settle behind them, but Cale knew the distance hadn't bought them safety. Jessie was closing in, and this time, Cale could feel something else in the air, something final. By dusk, they'd made camp in a copse of cedar trees, far enough from the trail to be hidden but close enough to the river that the current drowned out every other sound. Cale built the fire low, the way his uncle had taught him, tight and smokeless, and kept his rifle across his knees as he watched the woods. Marin sat opposite him, braiding her damp hair with shaking fingers, her face unreadable. "He's going to find us," she said finally, her voice not fearful but matter-of-fact. Cale didn't deny it. "He's already close." "Then why stop?" she asked. "Why not keep riding through the night?" Cale looked up at her then, and the truth was plain on his face. "Because I'm tired of running," he said, "and because he wants to end this, so do I." Marin studied him, her eyes catching the firelight. "And if we die?" He shrugged once, slow and deliberate. "Then at least we die on our feet." She didn't speak after that, but she moved closer to him, close enough to share the heat from the flames, and they sat like that in silence for a long while, until the wind shifted, and Cale stood without a word. He stepped into the dark, his body low, ears tuned to every rustle. Then he saw it movement through the trees, a glint of metal catching the moonlight. He dropped to a crouch, finger on the trigger, and counted them. 2 riders. Jessie would be close. Kyle returned to camp fast and quiet. "They're here," he said. "We've got minutes, maybe less." Marin rose, her body tense, her eyes full of something deeper than fear. "Then let's end it." He handed her a revolver. "You remember how to use it?" She nodded, eyes flashing. "I remember more than they think." The first shot split the night like a whip crack. Cale spun toward it, already moving, already firing. He hit the first rider clean in the shoulder, dropping him into the mud with a grunt. Marin had taken cover behind a tree, her jaw tight, her eyes sharp, and she fired once, twice, missing the second man but driving him off course. Then came Jessie. Not on horseback, but walking through the trees like a storm wearing skin. He was older than Cale remembered, leaner but mean, with eyes that burned with something sick and satisfied. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to stop," Jessie called out, his voice echoing. "Figured you'd keep running like always." Cale stepped into the clearing, rifle raised. "You talk too much, Jessie." Jessie laughed. That same laugh from years ago, the one Cale remembered from the cage, from the barn, from the worst nights of his childhood. "Still got that mouth on you. Shame about the girl. You gonna hand her over this time, or do I have to take her again?" Cale's voice turned to steel. "You'll never touch her again." "Oh," Jessie said, cocking his pistol. "So you do remember." Cale didn't answer. He just pulled the trigger. The shot hit Jessie in the leg, and the older man went down with a howl, scrambling behind a log. "You're dead, boy," Jessie screamed. "You hear me?" "I've been dead since Kansas," Cale muttered. "This is just the reckoning." Marin stepped out from behind the tree, walking straight into the line of fire, and Cale's heart nearly stopped. "Marin, no!" he shouted. But she was calm, eerily calm, her revolver raised and steady. "Jessie," she said, voice cutting through the trees like a bell. "Do you remember my face?" There was a pause, then a slow, cruel chuckle. "I remember all the girls. Then remember this." Her shot cracked like thunder. The bullet took him through the shoulder, dropping him for good. Cale ran to her, took her by the shoulders. "You could have been killed." She looked up at him, face pale, eyes blazing. "I had to do it. I had to be the one." He nodded slowly, understanding written in every line of his face. Together they walked to Jessie's crumpled body. He was breathing, barely. Kyle knelt beside him. "You die slow," he said, "like the poison you are." Jesse spat blood, his last act of defiance, but Kyle stood and walked away. He would not let Jesse take one more thing from him, not even vengeance. Marin took his hand. They didn't speak, as they watched the dawn rise through the trees, but something in the silence between them had changed. They weren't running anymore. They were choosing what came next. They buried Jesse at the base of a willow tree, not out of mercy, but because even poison should be sealed in the ground and left behind. The soil was wet from the last night's rain, and the work was quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion that seeps into the marrow. Cale didn't speak as he shoveled the last of the earth over the man who'd haunted his nightmares since childhood, and Marin didn't ask for words. She stood with the wind tugging at her coat, the pendant still wrapped around her fingers, and watched as the past was finally laid to rest. When it was done, Cale dropped the shovel and stared at the mound of dirt. "That's it," he said. "That's the last ghost." Marin stepped closer, her voice softer than the wind. "There'll be others. Maybe not men like him, but echoes. They don't go quiet just because we stop running." He looked at her then, eyes bloodshot, lips pressed into a line. "But they'll chase us less if we stop feeding them." She nodded, and for the first time, her shoulders dropped the weight she'd carried since Kansas. The ride away from that place wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. For the first time in years, there was no one on their trail. They followed the river west, through the hills that turned gold in the morning sun and purple by dusk. Kyle had no destination in mind, but each mile felt like peeling back layers of old skin. Marin didn't ask questions. She didn't plan. She just rode beside him, silent as starlight, her gaze always somewhere in the horizon, as if she were finally allowing herself to wonder what a life could be. On the fourth day, they reached a plateau where the land opened into a quiet valley, ringed by pines and broken by a clear stream that danced over smooth stones. Kyle pulled his horse to a stop. "Here," he said. Marin blinked at the clearing, then turned to him. "Here, what?" He dismounted, boots crunching soft grass. "This is where I stop." Her face faltered just slightly, and her voice turned wary. "You're leaving?" He shook his head. "No, I'm staying. To build. To breathe. To stop running. But you," his voice caught. "You're free to go wherever you want. You always have been." She looked around slowly, taking in the trees, the stream, the silence. "I never knew what I'd do when I had a choice," she said. "I always imagined riding into a town, buying a dress, maybe opening a bookshop, something small and warm." Cale smiled. "Then do it." She hesitated. "Unless—" He waited, but she didn't finish. Instead, she stepped off her horse and walked until she was beside him, her eyes full of that same quiet fire. "Unless here is warm enough." He didn't say anything, but he reached for her hand and held it like it was the only truth left in the world. That night, they made camp in the heart of the valley. Kyle set stones for a foundation, and Marin cleared a path down to the stream. They didn't speak much, but it didn't matter. Words weren't the glue anymore. It was the way she handed him a hammer without asking, the way he built a second bedroll beside his without needing to explain, the way they both kept glancing up from their work, just to make sure the other was still there. On the seventh day, when the stars bloomed in a velvet sky, Cale sat by the fire and took out the piece of cedar he'd carried for weeks. He began carving, slow and careful, the way he used to, when the world was simpler. Marin leaned over. "Another pendant?" He nodded. "This one's different." "How?" she asked. "This one's not for protection," he said. "It's a promise." When he handed it to her, she turned it over in her palm. Carved into the surface was a bird in flight wings outstretched, rising. "A promise for what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For whatever comes next," he said. "Together." She closed her fingers around the pendant and leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in both their lives, they sat without fear. Morning came, and the sky was clear. Kyle rose early, gathered stones for the hearth, and began laying the first rows. Marin joined him with flour in her apron, ready to bake the bread she'd bartered from a woman in a town 2 days' ride east. The house wasn't finished. The valley was wild, but there was a rhythm now, soft and steady, a place to begin. And in the distance, The birds sang a song that had no name but felt like home. The cabin walls were barely higher than Kael's waist, but the way Marin traced her fingers along the raw timber made it feel like a cathedral. She moved carefully, deliberately, as if every notch and beam deserved reverence, and Kael found himself watching her more than the horizon these days. The valley had gone from empty wilderness to something that felt stitched with breath and promise, though neither dared call it home just yet. That morning, as Kael fit another log into place, Marin disappeared for a while. No word, no explanation, just the soft crunch of footsteps receding into the pines. He let her go. He always would. But the silence that followed crept under his skin like a draft. When she returned near sundown, her arms were full of wildflowers and her cheeks pink from the wind, but her eyes held something else. Something unspoken. She knelt beside the fire pit and began weaving the stems into a chain without looking at him. He didn't press her. Not until the sun dropped behind the ridge and the shadows lengthened. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She didn't stop her fingers. "Do you remember what you said? That day in the barn, when you cut the chains?" Kael nodded, the memory flaring sharp and brutal. "You asked me my name," she said, "and I gave you a false one." He shifted. "Didn't matter. You were bleeding and bound. I didn't need a name to know I had to get you out." She set the flower chain on her lap and looked up, the firelight flickering across her face. "But I need to say it now. My real name." Kael waited, heart thudding once in his throat. "It's Marin Kaelson." The fire cracked, a log split, but Kael didn't move. "Say that again." Her voice barely trembled. "Marin Kaelson. My father was Elias Kaelson. You probably never heard of him. But my mother did, long enough to carry his name. And mine." Kael sat back slowly, his body gone still as stone. "You're saying, I think you're my brother," she said. "Or half of one." The night went silent around them. Even the wind seemed to pause. Kael's breath caught in his chest and stayed there. "How long have you known?" "Since I saw your last name carved into that carving knife." Back at the cabin in Del Hollow, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the cedar blade he'd forgotten, the one he'd carved long ago, initials scrawled into the hilt. "E.K. for Elias Kaelson," she whispered. "I had seen that before. My mother showed it to me in her sewing box. Said it belonged to the man who never came back." Kael stared at the knife, the fire, her. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want the man who saved me to be someone I'd have to mourn all over again." Her voice cracked then, not from sorrow but from the weight of too many lifetimes in too few years. "But you're not him. You're not Elias. You're what he could have been if he hadn't run." Kael looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused. "I hated him," he said. "All my life. For the way he left my mother. For what came after. I buried him in my mind before I knew what a grave even was." "I know," she said. "I hated him too." They sat there for a long time, two children of a man neither of them truly knew, bound not by blood but by what they survived in its absence. Kael reached across the fire, slowly, and took her hand. "So what now?" She blinked. "Now? Now that we're not who we thought we were." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Now we build anyway. Because maybe this is what family is, not the ones who leave us, the ones who stay." He nodded, the air between them heavier and clearer all at once. "Sister," he said softly, trying the word out like a stone in the mouth. She smiled fully then. "Brother." The word fit, not like armor, but like skin. They stayed by the fire till the embers turned silver, the flower chain forgotten on the dirt between them. In the morning, the work continued. One wall, one beam, one day at a time. The storm rolled in, low and growling, a dull, distant warning like a throat clearing before a sermon. Kael tightened the ropes on the tarp, while Marin braced the kindling beneath the overhang, their eyes meeting once with a silent agreement. Get through the weather, then talk. Because that morning the sheriff's horse had shown up riderless, saddle bloodied, and someone would come asking. The law didn't forget men like Kael, and it sure as hell didn't forget missing men with stars on their chests. But tonight the rain mattered more. It came down in hard sheets, just as they made it inside, thunder shaking the half-built walls like an angry god trying to test their resolve. Marin lit the lantern and stood watching it flicker as Cale peeled off his soaked shirt and used it to block the worst of the draft coming through the window gaps. She hadn't said much since their conversation about the name they shared, but there was something in the way she moved around him now, careful, not afraid, but steady, like she was memorizing the way light hit his shoulders, like she needed to understand the weight of what he carried if she was going to carry part of it too. "Do you still want to run?" she asked. The storm gave him an excuse not to answer. He kept his eyes on the fire and stirred the pot once, twice, before speaking. "I want to finish the cabin," she nodded. "Even if they come?" "Especially if they come." He turned to her. "They'll say I kidnapped you, took you across state lines. You'll have a noose waiting if they spin it the way they always do." "They won't get to write my story," she said. "I'll speak it myself if I have to." Cale's jaw flexed. "It won't matter. They'll hang me just for breathing free. Then let's make the days count until they try." Her voice was so quiet it could have been a prayer or a curse, and Cale didn't know which he hoped for more. He crossed the space between them and reached for her hand. "I know you're not mine," he said. "Not in the way I thought, but you're my people, and I'll fight to keep you safe like blood never did for either of us." Marin gripped his hand back hard. "Same goes." The wind howled through the trees, and a branch smacked the roof tarp like a war drum. But the fire held, and so did they. Later that night, after the rain softened into a lullaby and the stew had been scraped clean from their bowls, Kael unwrapped a small cloth from the drawer beside his cot. Inside lay the old carving knife, the one she'd shown him days ago. He set it on the table between them. "You should have it." Marin shook her head. "It's yours. It belonged to him. It marked both of us. You carry it now, not because of him, but in spite of him." Slowly, she reached out and took the knife, turning it over in her hand like a question with no answer. "What are we going to say when they come?" she asked. Cale looked at her for a long moment. "The truth. That I found a girl locked in a barn and cut her chains. That she walked out beside me, not behind me. That we built something no law could understand." Marin stared at the knife, the carved initials darkened by age. "Maybe it's better if they don't understand. Let them wonder why two broken kids would risk everything to keep each other breathing." A gust of wind hit the walls again, but the beams held. Cale stood and walked to the door, pressing his palm to the fresh-cut frame. "We build the rest tomorrow," he said. "Then we don't run anymore." Marin joined him there, her shoulder brushing his. "We stay." Outside, the storm moved on, leaving the air thick with earth and pine, and the sky cracked open just enough to show a sliver of stars. Inside, the cabin stood unfinished, imperfect, but unshaken. The kind of place born not from blood, but from choice. The sun rose slow that morning, like it wasn't sure the world deserved light just yet. The air was heavy, not from weather but from knowing, and Cale felt it in his bones before the first crow even sounded. They were coming. He didn't say it out loud, didn't need to. Marin felt it too. She dressed quiet, pulled her hair back with a leather tie, and went about boiling coffee like it was any other day. But her hands shook once when she reached for the tin mug, and Cale crossed the room just to still them with his own. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "They don't get to find us crawling." They ate what little bread they had left, sat on the porch together without speaking, just watching the ridge where the trail bent. By mid-morning, the dust came, rising in low swells behind a column of horses. Not townsfolk, not bounty men either. No, these were federal, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed, rifles ready and papers in hand. The kind of men who didn't ask questions, only confirmed names. Kael stood as they approached, and Marin beside him. No weapons, no retreat, just the cabin and the truth, and a silence older than the both of them. The leader dismounted first, boots sinking into the dirt like roots. He looked between them, then at the cabin, then back again. "Caleson," he said. "We've been looking a long time." Kael didn't flinch. "I didn't hide. Just built." The man's eyes moved to Marin. "You're the girl from the Del Hollow registry." Marin stepped forward. "The one listed as missing, or stolen, depending on which man you believe." The officer raised a brow. You admit he took you? No. I walked out of a cage and into my own life. He just cut the lock. The man glanced back at his deputies, then at the papers. There's a warrant for him in 3 counties. Assault, arson, resisting arrest. Kyle held his ground. And not a word of what that sheriff did to her, what he kept in his barn. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he handed the paper to Kale. This warrant's real, but so is what she just said. So I'm going to ask Oncedo you have cause to dispute these charges formally. Kale looked at the cabin, at Marin, then at the knife still tucked into her waistband. Only that I did what any decent man would have done if the world didn't beat the decency out of him. The officer studied him for a long beat, then folded the paper back up and put it away. Sheriff Witt was found dead. Someone slit his throat. Folks say it was a card game gone wrong. Others think it was one of his possessions come back to collect. Either way, he ain't talking now. Kale's voice was flat. Wasn't me. Didn't say it was. And truth is, no one much cares. Man had blood on his boots long before you spilled a drop. The officer turned, whistled once, and the men behind him relaxed their grips on the rifles. You ever leave this county, you might want to keep your head low. Not every badge out there has a soul attached to it. Kale nodded once. Understood. They watched the riders fade back down the trail, dust curling behind them like smoke from a fire that didn't catch. Marin exhaled. Kale didn't. Not yet. They didn't move until the trail was clear and the wind returned. Then she turned to him, her eyes rimmed red and unblinking. What now? He reached for her hand, slow and solid. We finish the roof, then maybe plant that herb garden you keep talking about. She smiled, small and real, and together they stepped back inside. The cabin was still rough, the floor still crooked. But it stood, not just from wood and sweat, but from what they'd endured to raise it. That night they sat beside the fire, their fingers laced, and Kale spoke only once. They'll come again. Different men, different flags. Marin leaned her head against his shoulder. Then we remind them what they can't burn. And outside, beneath the stars, the wind swept clean across the porch, carrying the scent of cedar, ash, and something else entirely freedom that didn't need permission. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched you, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let us feel a little closer across the miles. Every story finds its home in the hearts of those who need it, and sometimes that's all it takes. If you'd like to hear more stories that lift the spirit and remind us of the quiet miracles around us, feel free to subscribe. We're building something meaningful here, and it means so much to have you along the way. From our hearts to yours, thank you for spending this time with us.